G20 summit of this afternoon. Now, overall, I would say that I'm quite satisfied with the outcome, which I consider to be fruitful. Let me just quickly cover the main outcomes now. First of all, there is a wide understanding that the humanitarian emergency that is occurring in Afghanistan is very serious indeed. Multiple people, representatives of international institutions and the UN are speaking in terms of humanitarian catastrophe. And they've also noted how the situation is getting even worse now that winter is nearer. Now, this is something that needs to be underscored. In fact, this is where we need to focus and where we need to reach an agreement, which has been reached, in fact, because there is a great willingness to take action. And I would say that we have agreed on the need to tackle the humanitarian emergency. And I would say that nearly everyone agrees that we need to take a unified stance vis-à-vis this goal that we have set for ourselves. So there is a mandate, a general mandate for the United Nations to coordinate the reply that is needed, and a mandate which will allow the UN to take direct action. So we have the different actors, the countries concerned, the European Union, and I will shortly say something about the EU as well as the international financial institutions, which are the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and the other UN agencies. So all of them will be operating under this umbrella, as it were. So I said I would say something about Europe. In fact, the President of the European Commission, Madame von der Leyen, announced that they will be dispersing $1 billion to this end. This is one of the pledges, one of the commitments made to finance the humanitarian response. So even the United States President announced that there would be an increase, if I'm not mistaken, to $300 million increase, or a disbursement of $300,000 to meet this need. And during our conversation, there were other issues, of course, that we considered. We have to prevent the economic collapse of the country. Now, that means a number of different things. In the near term, we have to make sure that the payment system in Afghanistan doesn't collapse. We have to make it possible to keep payments. Payments have to be made. So we need to try to save whatever is left of the banking system, because if the banks collapse entirely, if the system collapses entirely, then it would be, again, very difficult to continue providing humanitarian assistance. So, as I was saying, the two go hand in hand. Now, there was another issue that we pointed out in our final summary. We didn't really deal with it extensively during the meeting itself, but we have to keep up our fight against COVID-19. Perhaps it's not the top priority, but if nothing is done, then the situation is going to get worse and worse. And we then covered other urgent matters. In other words, how to provide relief for migrants, what kinds of programs are needed. And then, setting aside the humanitarian dimension, we also focused on human rights. And I would say that pretty much everyone focused on the rights of women, and we have to make sure that they will keep having access to education, that we mustn't go back 20 years on this point. And I do believe that all the G20 participants pointed that out. We We also agreed on the need for Afghanistan to not become a haven, a sanctuary for international terrorists. And I would say that all the leaders are indeed committed to that. And that means that we have to coordinate our fight against terrorism. And we then moved on to some operational matters. One of them has to do with the Kabul airport. Now, if the Kabul airport is not open, it will be very difficult to organize and coordinate international assistance. We also spoke of the need to have neighboring countries involved somewhat in these operations, because we have to try to put some order in what is being done. More than 600,000 people are displaced, and we have millions of migrants who have gone missing. So basically, we have to try to make these people, these migrants, more visible. We have to make sure that all these movements are done in an orderly fashion. And we also have a summary of the meeting where we see the principles, the objectives, our actions and measures that we hope to adopt. Basically, that's what we discussed, and I also asked everyone to try to work together, especially when it comes to our humanitarian response, because this is how we can hope to overcome the inevitable differences in foreign policy, geopolitical views, and I would say that we all agree on that. So I will stop there, and I'm very happy to answer any of your questions. Thank you. Now, we have about 10 people who've asked to ask questions. We have Italian press and international press. Marco Galluzzo, Corriere della Sera, may start. Good afternoon, President. And let me ask you if the absence of Putin and President Xi Jinping are due to any special reason. Did they tell you that there was a special reason, maybe because President Biden was there? And is there anything that can be done with regard to Afghanistan? In other words, can these two countries be fully involved?
Non era dovuta a motivi specifici, è stata comunicata in anticipo che sarebbero stati rappresentati uno dal ministro degli esteri e un altro non mi ricordo, un altro ministro, insomma, del governo, del Consiglio di Stato. E quindi no, il coinvolgimento c'è stato moltissimo prima della riunione. Tenete presente poi che questa riunione del G20 viene dopo un'assemblea generale delle Nazioni Unite e dopo il meeting ministeriale dei ministri degli esteri. Quindi il coinvolgimento è stato continuo durante tutto questo periodo e continuerà per la preparazione del G20 sanità, del G20 clima di fine mese. Quindi no, su quello non credo di poter dire che ci sono stati motivi particolari di politica estera. In generale questo meeting io lo considero un successo, perché credo che sia la prima occasione in cui i leader hanno dato una risposta multilaterale alla crisi afghana. Ed è veramente uno dei primi casi, prime affermazioni di multilateralismo che c'è stata quest'anno. Quindi se uno vuole avere una prospettiva un pochino più di lungo periodo nel giudicare questo evento, potrebbe dire che insomma tutto sommato il multilateralismo sta ritornando con fatica, ma sta ritornando come schema di lavoro dei paesi più importanti del mondo.
John Follen per Bloomberg.
Prime Minister, a question in English. Several G20 members are talking to the Taliban, but they're not recognizing the government. I'd like to ask you, what prospects are there for all members of the G20 to recognize the government, to help deal with the humanitarian crisis, and especially with the economic chaos underway now?
There will be different stages. Now we have to answer the humanitarian crisis. That's a very first thing. If that requires, and it will do, it will require contacts with the Taliban. There's no alternative to having contacts with them. They are essential for this answer, for this response to be effective. But as you said, that doesn't imply a recognition. A recognition will have to acknowledge that the Taliban will be judged for what their deeds are, not their words. The government, as we know, it's not really inclusive. It's not really representative. The women's right, so far as we can see, we seem like going back 20 years, at least now. So recognition means, at least by most of the G20 countries, means that progress has been made exactly along the words and the commitments the Taliban government took a few days ago.
Gerardo Perosi.
Gerardo Perosi, Sole 24 Ore. Good afternoon. The desperate images of Camp Arena, it was like a part of Italy in Afghanistan, and so we really wonder what was done in so many years, what could have been done better, and what will be done in the future for that country. There are two fronts that you mentioned, the humanitarian front and the financial emergency. The Western international community, as far as the Afghan budget is concerned, $8 billion was essential, but now there's going to be a problem regarding the public accounts of that country. Did you think of a roadmap of several steps regarding this aid, and what role can Italy play within the G20 and also within Europe in order to promote this process? The mandate that we gave the United Nations has exactly that purpose, developing a roadmap in order to help fast. The UN have already started. One of the first things we should ask the Taliban is whether it is possible for the UN and for the UN plus other countries to get in and out of the country, and what kind of freedom of movement would they have. This is not easy, but the crisis is so huge, so enormous, that this should and could be done. From the economic point of view, appropriations are very substantial. The EU in particular has committed $1 billion, as recently announced. Our appropriation is one of the highest in Europe, I think. The US also, as I said, gave a large amount of money. So there's a great willingness. Plus, we should think of the IMF and the World Bank, which are also going to contribute. But there's something more besides the humanitarian assistance. We need the economy to be there. We need to prevent its collapse. And so we need more resources to keep them alive, the banking system or the few surviving banks alive. France Presse, Alvise Ermellini. Good afternoon. I'd like to ask you whether Mr. Putin's absence is somehow linked to the fact that Iran and Pakistan have not been invited. Minister Lavrov had asked for them to be invited when he was in Rome last time. And then was it worthwhile organizing this meeting with the absence of China and Russia? As I said earlier, yes, it was worthwhile indeed. It is the first multilateral response to the Afghan crisis. It is very important. It was confirmed that the UN will be the Mr. Putin's absence, as far as I know, there's no link between the fact that no, I don't think that we were asked to invite Iran, but anyway, I don't think there's anything to do with that. We talked a few weeks ago. We had a long, cordial conversation. No, so I would say no. And the same applies to President Xi. So, no. And everybody else was there. So it was a very important opportunity also to smooth everything out. Some said it's your responsibility. You are responsible for what happened. But instead of starting to discuss, we were all aware that this is an emergency and that the G20 has an enormous responsibility vis-à-vis the Afghan people and vis-à-vis the country as a whole, because we've been there, we've stayed there for over 20 years. So there's no uncertainty at all about the fact that we also are responsible for the whole thing and that it is our duty to do something. Roberto Kinzari, TG1.
I'd like to go back to the issue of Russia and China. The US are also back to multilateralism. So what strategy is there to strengthen this positive course that was launched today with China and Russia, considering the upcoming G20 in late October, when you have to discuss climate change, reforming the international trade, and then, of course, fighting the pandemic? How can you be more effective in dealing with these dossiers? Yes, it is essential for both China and Russia to participate in the G20 meeting, not only by participating, but of course we need economic, environmental solutions. Many measures have already been adopted by Russia and China, and perhaps more will come. Our foreign affairs ministers and our diplomats have done a wonderful job in organizing the G20 meetings, and they're still working, of course, on the preparation for the summit at the end of the month. Now, there is great focus on climate, of course, but all these commitments will not be realistic unless China and Russia are on board. Of course, India as well must be on board. And this is not something that we could take for granted up until a short while ago, and that is that we all realize that these problems cut across international borders, so we can deal with them, we can perhaps even resolve them only if we take a multilateral approach. I think that this is the major change that we have compared to a year ago, because there's no longer any uncertainty. We also need to be very ambitious when it comes to our climate and environmental goals. There's no doubt about that. We become uncertain when we have to decide how fast, how swift we want to be in pursuing our objectives, because, of course, we are in different situations. So that is what we're trying to discuss today. We now have Esma Kashir from the Turkish television. Good afternoon, Prime Minister. President Erdogan of Turkey said again today that Turkey cannot take in any Afghan migrants or refugees, and he also proposed a working group on migration within the framework of the G20. How do you feel about that proposal? Well, when the proposal was made, I said that it was interesting from the very start, but of course the other members have to agree. So we will be discussing it in the coming days with the other members of the G20. Now, as you know, because this is done also within the EU, we are in favor of coordinating a response when it comes to international migration. And in fact, we are doing this. As we've always said, we've been pretty much left to our own devices in this matter. So this is an initiative, I think, that is, in fact, moving in that direction. But as I said, we'll have to see whether the other member countries are willing to participate in that idea. We have a question from Simone Cantarini, Agenzia Nova. Good afternoon, Prime Minister. My question has to do with the ways in which you plan to disperse this financial aid in support of the Afghan economic system. How will this be done? And will you also be discussing this with partners like Russia and Uzbekistan and Tajikistan in order to make it possible for this to occur, this kind of support? Yes, well, the neighboring countries, of course, have to be involved, and this is a point that was raised from the very start, especially by the Russian Federation. In any case, I would say that everyone agrees. The neighboring countries around Afghanistan must all be involved in this response. And this can occur in many different ways, and it is already happening, I would say. There are hundreds and thousands, maybe millions of migrants who, of course, have ended up in neighboring countries, at least for the time being. So these neighboring countries are, whether they like it or not, involved, and they have to manage this very novel situation, which is clearly not over because the migration will continue. And that is why it is so important to take immediate action. We have a question from Ilario Lombardo of La Stampa. Good afternoon, Prime Minister. It's I can't escape raising Italian issues. No, actually you can avoid it. Well, it is an opportunity for you to say something about Italy. So please go ahead with your question then. I'd like to know, I mean, since the government will have a last word on this, I'd like to know whether you will be disallowing Forza Nuova to operate. Well, we are examining the situation, but of course the magistrates are as well. In fact, the members of the judiciary are continuing with the investigations, and they are somehow formulating their conclusions. So we are pondering the situation, of course, in connection with Forza Nuova. Daniel Verdu, El País. And then one more question after that. Good afternoon. Okay, let me go back to Afghanistan now. With regard to the evacuation, we know that the first phase is already over. So the emergency phase of the evacuation plan is over, but we know that there are still many people who are still there and many asylum seekers as well. So how will the second phase be implemented? And do you have a number of how many people might be involved? Well, the Italian government has ensured that 5,000 people will be evacuated from Afghanistan. I think this is one of the highest numbers within the European Union. And Germany and the UK, of course, they have done quite a bit of work. So this is quite significant. But as you said, it's not sufficient. We still have many people there who need to be evacuated. And the UN, again, are trying to get the Afghan government, the Taliban, to agree to some corridors. In other words, allowing the people who wish to leave to do so. And then, of course, we would have to provide whatever assistance might be needed. So there haven't been any real changes since the end of the emergency evacuation phase. In any case, this is what I've been observing. I mean, during this 2020 meeting that we had today, I see that there is willingness and there is an awareness of the need to get all these people out. We know that these people want to leave, that they need assistance, and that it is our responsibility to help them. And many of them have also gone to neighboring countries, and we're also going to have to intercept them to see where they are, because they won't be able to stay in those countries for very long. Now, the American government has deployed some groups of Afghans who've cooperated with the armed forces in other countries around the region as well. So this is what's actually happening. It's very complicated. The situation is ongoing, but my idea is that we're trying to deal with it. We're not trying to avoid it, of course.
Thank you, Prime Minister. Mark Alexander Lawyer from the BBC.
Anch'io vorrei fare.
I'd like to speak English, if you don't mind.
There's no choice but to speak to the Taliban. Do all G20,
There's no choice
but to speak to the Taliban and to engage with the Taliban at this stage. Do all G20 leaders agree on that? And what are your red lines or conditions for recognizing the Taliban government? And what measures are being put in place to ensure that Afghanistan does not become a haven for international terrorism, as you suggested?
Well, the answer to your first question is that it's very hard to see how one can help the Afghan people, which is a big number, and Afghanistan is a big country, without some sort of involvement of the Taliban government, of de facto government, let's call it this way. Very difficult to begin with to bring the necessary aid. I mean, if they don't want us to enter, we don't enter. So this is the degree of involvement, which, as I said, doesn't imply at all recognition. Recognition is a political decision that would be taken only when the international community, agrees that progress has been made on various issues, the respect of human rights, of women, girls, education, essential individual freedoms, and so on. And right now, there isn't any progress that we can see. We see that the government, it was said that the government would be inclusive. It was not inclusive. It was said that the government would be representing various ethnical minorities and gender-wise. It was not. It's not inclusive. It was not representative. So I think it's early for any form of recognition. So we have to wait for that. Now, the concrete measures to fight international terrorism, at this point in time, what I can say is that certainly different forces in different countries cooperate between them. Cooperation is the primary response to fight international terrorism. Exchange of information, cooperation has been a very effective response in the past few years. And now, of course, has to be strengthened around this. Also, I don't have visibility, maybe others do, I don't have visibility about the exact nature of the relationship between the Taliban government and the ISIS. One has the sense that it's not exactly, I would say, a relationship of friendship. That's what we had episodes of various. I mean, we have the bombing of the mosque, and that is certainly something that the Taliban government didn't want to have. We had the other incident between the Taliban forces and the ISIS, and many other considerations would suggest that we should know more about that. And that is a very important consideration, of course.
Grazie, concludiamo questa conferenza.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for all of you who took part and who organized it.